Good evening, and thank you for enjoying it with a six-pack, the Sconnie Six Pack, the only podcast talking all things Wisconsin sports at just 6 days a week. I'm your host, Kedrick Stumbris. You can find me on the website formerly known as Twitter at Kedrick Stumbris or on Bluesky. And tonight we need to talk about what is wrong with the Wisconsin Badgers defense. It is late here on a Wednesday. Appreciate any and all of you for joining us here. As you're getting ready for a holiday weekend. Not necessarily dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but latticing the pies and maybe uncanning the peas. That was on the fly, by the way. I didn't do that one on purpose. Too bad. Appreciate you all here. If you are watching live, either by finding us on youtube.com/@Sconnie6Pack or by following me on the website formerly known as Twitter. Appreciate it. If you are listening to the podcast feed after the fact, we will later have an exclusive one-on-one interview with a few guys from the Wisconsin Badgers basketball team coming up after this for our premium subscriber members over at Sconnie6Pack.substack.com. We'll try to fire in as many of your questions here during the live show as we can into all this and incorporate them during the show as well. But let's get into it before we get into the happy stuff in the basketball side as much as we can later on in the week. We got to talk some football and Mark D coming in hot with do they dare fire Tressel too if they lose? I don't know. Fire is strong for, I think, what is the most. It's too strong for, I think, what the most likely outcomes are there. But let's get into it at the tail end there. The biggest problem with the Wisconsin Badgers defense is they can't dial up pressure. They can't disrupt plays. And I know that sounds maybe like a pedestrian analysis. But this is a problem that we identified early in this year. On this show, we talked about how Western Michigan, when Wisconsin was going to open the season against Western Michigan, that Wisconsin was going to have its weakest position challenge, and that being its defensive line. Not just the defensive line, but the entire front seven. And that was my line going into that game in the season opener. Was I thought Western Michigan was a little bit live in that game because Wisconsin didn't have the bodies up front. When we did the preseason show about the position groups that had something to prove this season, number one, chief among them, was the defensive lineman. And after that was the outside linebackers. And that's because the defensive linemen were a lot of bodies that were not high-level recruits, that hadn't shown a ton of production at Wisconsin. And then the outside linebackers were a lot of guys who had come into the room and were very new. And Wisconsin brought in a lot of new guys in the offseason, which meant that Luke Fickell and Mike Tressel and company didn't like their options there. And now, this year, it is all borne out. And this has been kind of bubbling in the greater Badger takeoverse this week, is talking a little bit about this lack of disruptive plays, lack of pass rush this week. And it feels like it's kind of reaching a breaking point where everybody wants to talk about it again, because we've gotten away from talking about it since the very beginning of the season, when it was clear that the Badgers couldn't get home against Western Michigan. They couldn't get home against South Dakota. They weren't able to do it against Alabama. It was an issue in the beginning of the year. It looked like it was going to be an issue throughout the season, and it ended up being an issue all season long. In terms of the overarching metrics through this season, Wisconsin's defense, not disruptive enough. In terms of tackles for loss, and Mark popping in again, there's been zero pass rush. That's on coaching, is it not? And I'm going to get to this a little bit at the end of the show. Like, yes, not at the end of the show, but this is part of the middle segment of the show. And the answer is kind of yes, kind of no. But when we're breaking down the numbers of 133 total teams in FBS, Wisconsin is dead last in tackles for loss. Not great. In sacks, Wisconsin is 114th of 133 FBS teams. And forgive me if I'm looking way over to the side during this one. We got the like double monitor crazy action here. Full podcasting blogging for my parents' basement this week for the holiday. Not beating any of the accusations. When it's not just sacks and tackles for loss that have been an issue, but it's not just those on their own. It is leading to the results that Wisconsin is not generating turnovers, is not getting off the field often enough. While the defense rather has been all right and not allowing a ton of scoring, has kept the offense in most games. The Nebraska game aside, right? The Iowa game aside, which of course in those two games, not doing it doesn't give you great feelings for what's to come next against Minnesota. But the lack of pass rush isn't just, they aren't getting pass rush and they aren't getting tackles for loss. It's also they're not generating interceptions. And you got a guy back there in Hunter Wohler, who frankly I don't think is going to go this week either. Which again, not great for a Minnesota defense that likes to pass the ball a lot. They're not generating interceptions. Wisconsin, of 133 FBS teams, is 107th in interceptions forced. And that's to be expected when you're not rushing the passer, when you're like not just in terms of pass rush, but when you're not making the quarterback hurry and make bad decisions. They're not going to throw the ball to you. And Hunter Wohler, who does a lot of things other than ball hawk, Ricardo Holman is dang good at that, and being a ball hawking corner. As much as your corner can be a ball hawk, it's really hard. Wisconsin overall is 96th in the country in turnovers forced, and that's tied with 10 other schools. So effectively, they're sub 100. Obviously, having an offense that is also prone to turn the ball over. Braden Locke has thrown an interception in every one of the games that he started so far this year. That means that Wisconsin is also sub 100 in turnover margin this year. This team doesn't have a pass rush. When it's not just the pass, they also just aren't getting runners behind the line of scrimmage. And it's a huge problem for this team getting offenses off schedule. And against a team like Iowa, which, and like that's kind of a bad example just because Iowa really trampled them, but they showed no ability whatsoever to get a team like Iowa off schedule when they had 2 down linemen. They rushed for 10 yards per carry. When they had 3 down linemen, they still rushed for 5 yards per carry. You're never going to get a team off schedule. And yeah, that's where some of the Mike Tressel question comes in here. But there have been some players that have disappointed on this team. And this is where, as Mark asked, it's on coaching, is it not? It is some on coaching, kind of like we mentioned the scheme. Should the way the Badgers play this scheme, although it's not that much different than what Jim Leonhard was doing in his time as defensive coordinator. There's clearly some level of talent drop off here as well, right? Particularly at outside linebacker, when you had a lot of guys, a lot of complementary guys that played really well for really long in this defense. Guys like Andy Van Ginkel and TJ Watt and secondary guys too. And this year, when they went into the offseason and tried to bolster the outside linebacker room. And this was a great point. I think it was Ryan Herrings who talked about this on Locked On Badgers earlier this week too. The failure they've had at the outside linebacker room is a failure because they invested a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of recruiting prowess, a lot of recruiting, like political capital, for lack of a better term, into recruiting some outside linebackers. And first is Jaheim Thomas, is John Pius. I want to talk about first because he is who I would have thought the staff could rely on to be something of a sneaky, really, really good addition for this team. And he just has been the furthest thing from that. and I don't want to do this middle segment of the show and just have it sound like I'm crapping on players. This is more of a like kind of postseason retrospective in the middle of the season, because who knows what happens on Friday, right? Whether or not it's a win or a loss, we are far enough into the season to be doing some retrospective stuff, and these questions and conversations about which players have disappointed are absolutely part of that. When dissecting what went right, what went wrong this season, and John Pius underperforming is absolutely one of those things. One of those things that went wrong. He was an FCS All-American, an FCS first team All-American last season at William and Mary. He left William and Mary third all time in tackles for loss. There, he left there fifth all time in career sacks at William and Mary. He has 2.5 sacks this season. Those are his only tackles for loss at Wisconsin. You go over to the other guys in the transfer portal they added at linebacker, like Jaheim Thomas. Added him from Arkansas. And at Arkansas, he was playing really well, was on pace to be their leading tackler, and looked really, really good until he was kind of inexplicably benched down the stretch. And like at times this season, it looks like we've understood why that's been the case. Although he is leading an SEC team in tackles, he had 6 tackles for loss a season ago. Jaheim Thomas has 2 tackles for loss this season. Guy who clearly the staff was counting on to play a really big part on this team. Another outside linebacker that they got in the portal, Leon Lowry. With all of the hullabaloo that this team went through getting Leon Lowry to Madison, you needed to expect him to be better. You needed him to be better. He had 7.5 tackles for loss last season at Syracuse. He had 3.5 sacks last season at Syracuse. This year, Leon Lowry has 1 sack under his belt. It's his only tackle for loss in Madison. That is 3 transfer portal linebacker swings and misses. Nothing. And Mark also asks, really appreciate you, Mark. Big fan of Mark. Was James Thompson too much of a loss for the defense that they just fell apart? I know he's one player, but he's a major one. He absolutely is. And I got a chance to talk to James Thompson at player media availability yesterday afternoon. And it is clear that I think he knows just how much he wants to be out there and how much this team needs him out there at this point, because they haven't had it up front without him. James Thompson Jr. had 5.5 tackles for loss last year on the defensive line. Yeah, injured in camp, tore his pec. And now he's seemingly forcing his way back from injury because a guy with a torn pec is better than their other options. Mark, I do think that it was a huge loss, not necessarily for the defense overall to fall apart, because there was some risk of this defense being flawed the whole year, but it was enough to where they couldn't withstand his loss up front on the defensive line, because their other options up there just weren't good enough. Their other options up there were guys like Ben Barton, who, like, their other options are guys who are Christ era guys who are like fringe Big Ten players at this point, especially in the new Big Ten. And that's not to give Luke Fickell and company a huge excuse, like to absolve them of culpability here, of responsibility here for not being able to build the defensive line, because the defensive line is the hardest position to build in college football. There are just not enough people on this earth who have the bodies to do it at the FBS level for 133 teams, especially at the very tip top of the sport. They're just aren't. You can't go get those guys in the portal. I tried saying that all offseason. But the staff is culpable and is directly responsible for all these outside linebackers they tried to add in the portal and they swung and missed on. Now, are they better than what their other options were going to be anyway? Maybe, yeah. But it's been rough. It's been rough. I think clearly, based on the way James Thompson talked about him going out there, and despite his mom kind of being like, "Are you sure that you should go out there?" After we're done here, feel free to go back on this YouTube channel, youtube.com/@Sconnie Six Pack, and go find his interview yesterday with the media. It's pretty good. It's pretty enlightening to just where his head is at going into this game against Minnesota. I think it's clear this team just needs him out there because they don't have better options. Kurt Neal on the defensive line, I think, has been a little bit disappointing as well. He has 2.5 tackles for loss. It's a little bit hard to crush a guy who's a redshirt sophomore on the D line. And it's a little bit hard, but it's not really hard. I don't mean that because he hasn't had enough time in the program. When you're a redshirt sophomore, and at this point, he's had 3 full seasons in the program. If we're adding this on to a 3rd full season, right? It's that clearly there were veterans above Kurt Neal that they expected more from, that they haven't been able to get anything out of, basically, in the front 7, and it's been hard. Like I said, I could go on. I could do this for a while, naming guys, but like I said at the very beginning of the season, this front 7 was made up of fringe Big Ten guys, FCS transfers. It just wasn't going to work. Elijah Hills has been a really, really good talent. He's been a hit in the portal. I didn't expect this to be perfect, and it's been rough. Before we get to the Minnesota of it all, I will answer some of your question here, Mark, on what I have thoughts about on the recruiting class. Mark says, I know this is way off topic, but I was wondering your thoughts on the upcoming recruiting class. I know they are highly touted, but if they underperform, oh boy. Also, I'm leaning toward not going to the transfer portal at all. It takes away opportunities for in-house recruiting development time. The portal is a necessity now because players are going to move. You need the portal to plug and play holes. And yeah, it doesn't, it's not a perfect system for developing players year 1 to year 4 or year 1 to year 5 anymore. And you run the risk of any given season, developing a player, giving them reps as a backup, and then having the time that you put in developing them be somebody else's benefit somewhere else, which is hard to do, hard to be put in the position of, which is why teams are going to keep going to the portal and why they're going to choose slightly more developed talent than talent that needs some work. And they're not going to be afraid to recruit over guys anymore. Ultimately, the bones of your classes in college football, I still pretty firmly believe, and I think quite a bit different on this in college football than I do in college basketball. I think there are too many people who want to make one-to-one comparisons between college football and college basketball, and I think they are just so different that it's not worth doing that. But in college football in particular, I think the vast majority of your roster should be high school recruiting guys, because the really good guys that you can get out of high school don't really hit the portal. There are a handful of those guys every single year. Caden Proctor, right? Very great offensive lineman for Bama. Hit the portal. Yeah, kind of goes to Iowa. Doesn't really go to Iowa. Goes back to Alabama, right? Most of these really good portal guys are really good relative to the rest of the guys in the portal. The best guys don't hit the portal. The best guys are kept in-house because it's easier to retain them. But you're right. If these classes underperform, it's a problem for Luke Fickell. The bigger problem is that this upcoming recruiting class in 2025, we're not going to know if they underperform for at least until 2026 at the earliest. We're going to get to see most of those guys. It's college football is the free development league for the NFL. Players don't turn 19 ready to play professional football at the Big Ten level, let alone the NFL level. I have faith that I shouldn't say faith. Faith feels very, very like college football head coach God complex, which is something I do try to steer away from, because I think too many people lean into it. I do believe that the talent on its way that is, one, already in the program, and two, committed verbally in this upcoming class is a step above what is currently in the program. But it takes time to develop that talent. It takes time to get those guys on the field. It's why we didn't see Christian Allegro, for example, get just starter snaps and just leave it at that from the beginning of the year this year, because it takes time to develop those guys. Even though Christian Allegro has been pretty solid when he's gotten a ton of reps this year. College football is a talent acquisition sport. That is the name of the game. It's my belief in that is largely influenced by Bud Elliott of 247 Sports, who I think is, the bang up authority on the subject. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right, Mark. If the 2025 recruiting class underperforms, oh boy, not only for Luke Fickell's job prospects, but because if we're talking about Luke Fickell's job prospects, we're talking about this Wisconsin Badgers program not being in a good place for quite a while. Because at this point in time, regardless of what happens on Friday, regardless of whether or not a 22-year-long bull streak continues or not, I think that things have gone so far that there is not another option at this point but to try to ride it out, and hope that you either find better defensive talent, find a better offensive scheme, or hopefully both, and you ride this out with Luke Fickell, that he has spent some time building the bones, rebuilding the infrastructure, the foundation of the program that died when Paul Christ neglected to staff a recruiting department for a year, which is something you can't do in a sport that, like I said, is a talent acquisition game more than anything else. Going back, Mark, to your question on, do the Badgers dare to fire Mike Tressel, gosh, if Wisconsin loses to Minnesota. I'm going to defer to my colleague Dylan Graff's reporting on this, who has said over for Badger Notes and Athlon Sports that there is a possibility that they give Tressel a co-DC title, but put him back as primarily a linebackers coach and bring in somebody new to call plays. I know that Alex Grinch is already on this staff as a co-DC, but I have no reason to believe that he would be the new play caller. I believe it would be somebody new. There is conversations from my understanding. They are doing anything and everything to save people's jobs. Yeah. who those people are. You're you'll have to fill in some blanks. um, in terms of hope for the game against Minnesota and what Wisconsin might be able to do, generating a pass rush, generating disruptive plays, hurrying the quarterback. Minnesota doesn't have a super studded offensive line. Not one that I look at and think is, cream of the crop in the sport. Not one that I look at and think is, like bully ball up front, Big Ten West of old. But Nebraska also had a pretty average offensive line too. On the season, Nebraska has allowed just one fewer sack than Minnesota, but Wisconsin couldn't get home against the Cornhuskers, right? And I understand that some of that Nebraska game was weird, and that's a weird one-game sample size where I just don't know what happened to the defense in that game. I have theories. I have educated theories, not any that I have the freedom to repeat here. But Wisconsin didn't get a single tackle for loss in that game at all. Against the Huskers, didn't get a single sack against the Cornhuskers. And Minnesota's a little bit worse in that tackle for loss department. They're not stellar. They're like below average. They're not terrible. But not good. I think their raw sack numbers and why they are higher than I would have initially expected is likely because they do pass so often. They pass on about 55% of their offensive plays to 45% rushing plays. The Gophers do. That is a pass first offense, which is Minnesota under whoever is offensive coordinating them at the time. Kind of flip-flops there between being a pass first and run first offense, depending on what kind of personnel that they got. So my guess is because they just have more dropbacks, their raw sack numbers are higher. You have to hope that the Badgers can pressure Minnesota when they drop back to pass, because they do pass so often, and I just don't know. I haven't seen it. There's not been a game this season where you look at it and say, no, that's the game where Wisconsin's pass rush woke up. I can't think of it. I can't. It's not super duper at all. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in that game. I was having a conversation yesterday, and I said, this is the first time that like I can remember, where if I am making a pick, I don't know that I'm picking Wisconsin to win this game. Yeah, it's gonna be rough. I think Luke Fickell has done an interesting job, from what I can tell, gearing guys up for this week, leaning into the rivalry of it all. A lot less leaning into the bowl streak of it all, from what I can tell, and I kind of understand that, just to get a little, opinionated here. My guess, my speculation is trying to lean into a 22-year bowl streak to motivate that locker room probably puts a lot of pressure on guys, who aren't even 22 years old, to understand that, like, hey, this thing is bigger than you as 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 a human on this planet, in terms of the time that you have been on it. I think that might be too much pressure, and it's a lot easier to motivate kids based on rivalries and that blood, that juice, those things that kids kind of understand growing up with. Oh, we hate the crosstown little league team. That's the team from the other side of the state that we see in the playoffs every year, right? I think it's easier for people to understand that, even if they don't grow up in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in Big Ten country. I think it's easier for them to get it, and they're motivated by that. I think we'll see. Yeah, I think that's gonna do it for tonight's live show. We're gonna try to have something up again tomorrow morning, for the Packer game as well. I think I'm gonna be at that tomorrow night. And I will be in. Oh man, I will be in Madison Friday morning for good, better, or worse. We shall see. If you are listening to this after the fact, after we are live in your podcast feed, whether here or on Spotify, on the Sconnie Six Pack.substack.com premium subscribers, click over, subscribe for $5 a month, and you'll be party to my one-on-one interview with one of the guys in Wisconsin's front court. And we have a few of those coming this week, a few one-on-ones that we're getting to this week. I also have some new stuff over on Athlon Sports that you can check out. That is going to be linked in the podcast description when this wraps up as well. For all of you, have a happy holiday. Mark, thanks so much for joining the chat, giving us some extra stuff to talk about here and round out the half hour. It was a great conversation. Enjoy the holiday if you are celebrating it. Enjoy the time off. Keep enjoying Feast Week. Lots of college basketball. The Badgers are back in action on Saturday against Chicago State. That should be a more relaxing game. Something to watch. Yeah, until we talk to you all again very soon, I'm Wisconsin, and go Pack Go.